Whoa, Barry. I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a giant axe looming ominously over your head right now, man. One false move, that axe is going to come down. It's going to split Barry clean in half. Somebody's got to do something. And quickly, too. Time is literally of the essence. Okay, so in today's video, we're going to be talking about Elder Jarl. That's right, Old Mountain Beard himself. I don't know if you all noticed, but in the last chapter, chapter 1172, Elder Jarl had a little bit of a feat added to him. Jarul kind of gave us a piece of lore about him that I guess we could have maybe assumed, but like learning about it was very interesting. And it was at the very end of the chapter, and it was in one little panel, so you might have missed it. But Elder Jarl, really the focus of the last chapter, I mean, it was mainly a recap chapter, but the big point of it, other than Zoro having a plan, was that Elder Jarl was essentially laying down the gauntlet to the world government and to the Gods Knights, and he was rallying all of the giants of Elbaf together, right? He was basically like, we will not stand for this shit anymore, right? And he says that, like, we're not going to be like Harold, you know, if you kidnap our children, it's going to be war, right? You know, you're going to take our children away to Marijois, please let them go, give them back to us, and we won't have any problems. But if you do continue to kidnap our children and take them to the Holy Land, they will not work as hostages. We are going to collectively, as a country, declare war against you. It is not going to be the way you want. We are not going to bend the knee to you. We are not going to be your own mercenary force, okay? That is essentially what Elder Jarl is saying. And it's not that he doesn't care about the children, but the whole point of this is that the Gods Knights were like, hey, Harold was supposed to amass a giant army for us that would literally do whatever we ordered them to do. And so that didn't happen during Harold's time. So now, because shit is hitting the fan with, you know, Vegapunk's message, and now Luffy has awakened his Devil Fruit, I think Emu is just like, okay, we're out of time. We're out of options. Go to Elbaf. Get that giant army I was supposed to have like 14 years ago, and then we're going to start doing things, you know, we're going to start the war or whatever, right? And so that's the plan, you know, and Jarl is essentially like, not a good plan. That's not going to be the way the plan is going to work. Even if you were to kidnap all of the children of Elbaf and take them back or even murder them, the implication is like, we're not listening to you. We're going to fight till the last, right? And a lot of the other giants on the island are all motivated like, yeah, Elder Jarl, you tell them, right? And it harkens back to the warrior nature of Elbaf and like the old giant warrior pirates. Like, remember, Jarl is a warrior from way, way back when, you know, even older than Dory and Bragi, right? He is over 400 years old. He is the oldest giant alive in the world, probably like the oldest like humanoid. Still not 100% on Emu here, but yeah, there's other, you know, creatures like Zunisha, for example, that are over 1,000 years old. Emmett was about that age as well. You know, there's other, you know, animals and stuff. I can't remember how old the Kraken is. I think Sarume is actually younger than Jarl. I think Sarume is only like 300 years old or something like that. So there's some other creatures like Sea Kings that have probably been alive for like maybe thousands and tens of thousands of years maybe. But when it comes to Jarl, he's a little over 400, okay? And this little piece of lore that we found out about, you know, Zoro was listening to this message. Man, I like this old bastard. You know, he doesn't take anything lying down. He's going forward, you know, declaring war on the entire world government. You know, that's a big deal, right? And by the way, some people have said, like, what if Jarl was bluffing? What if he was lying about it? You know, just as like, please give us back our children, and if you take them, you know, we will not bend to you. We will not listen to you. And it wasn't actually, you know, he wasn't being serious, like he was just trying to get them to release the children. I really don't think so, because given Jarl's like temperament and like the environment that he grew up in, and you know, he was the captain of the giant warrior pirates back in the day, this is sort of like the thing that a warrior of his like his prestige, I guess, would say, right, from that time period, right? It's like, we're never going to listen to you. It's never going to happen. You could take as many of us as you want. It's not going to occur, right? Like, just, we're going to fight to the last, okay? And so Hiruden kind of confirms that. He says, yeah, I bet you would like that guy, because 300 years ago, he was the strongest warrior, the strongest pirate, the strongest giant in the entire world, right? About 3 centuries past, Elder Jarl was the guy. Before Luffy, before Kaido, before Gold D. Roger, before Rocksteady Zebek, before the Great Leviathan, before all of these great pirates that have ruled over the Grand Line, there was Elder Jarl. and I guess Elder Jorul as well. I think that's the idea, because a lot of the commanders of the giant warrior pirates are always like a duo. At least we know Dory is the blue ogre and Bragi is the red ogre, and they're the ones that are the captains right now. And so the previous generation would have been Jarl and Jorul, same kind of deal. So I think that's what Hyrudin meant. I think like back in the day, it was Jorul and Jarl that were the strongest warriors on the seas, okay? Now, Jarl is a little over 400 years old, so obviously he wouldn't have been the biggest badass, 400 years ago when he was like a baby. So it was around 300 years ago. So I pulled out the old timeline, and interesting stuff, because now we actually have a calendar system. So the year in One Piece on the Sea Circle calendar is currently 1541. So Hyrudin didn't give an exact date. He just said around 300 years ago. So winding it back to the year 1241, or approximately around that area. That was also around, by the way, keep in mind, when Dory and Bragi were around 100 years old. Or actually, they were a little younger. When Dory and Bragi were around 50, 60 years old, that was when they were sort of like the monsters that were ruling over the Grand Line, okay? That was when they each caught one of those sea kings, and they got into that argument over that hunting contest. Dory and Bragi are around 160 years old right now, so they had been fighting on Little Garden since they were in their like late 50s, early 60s. All right, and so yeah, so Elder Jarl and Elder Jorul would have been like maybe that's when they started their pirate journey. Over the decades, earned some prestige. They did not get into a hunting contest. So yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like, if Dory and Bragi never got into that argument, if that little kid on that random island never asked them, like, wow, you both killed these giant sea kings, so which one was bigger? Which one of you got the bigger sea king? And then, Bragi and Dory were like, wait a minute, it was mine, Dory. No, it was mine, Bragi. And then they got into a fight. If that never happened, right, and they just continued as the captains of the giant warrior pirates, maybe they would have had that prestige, but that kind of hampered them, right? That never happened with Jarl and Jorul back in their day, okay? So what was going on 300 years ago? Well, we don't really know that much. See, I think at this point in the story, because we know a lot about what's been happening in the last century, because a lot of the characters' backstories and stuff, we go back far enough, we learn about like what was happening around a decade ago. That ties in a lot to Jinbei's backstory with like the Sun Pirates. We go back 20 years ago, that's the backstory with like O'Hara and the death of Goldie Roger. We just finished a flashback that takes place around 40-ish years ago, okay, with God Valley. So we know a lot about the previous century, okay, and then we had Kuma's backstory, which was like very recent events. Kuma's backstory was interesting because it actually was so recent, it tied into like the events of One Piece like a year or so before Luffy left on his journey, and then it kind of went into the journey. That was really sweet, right? We know a little bit about what was going on around 400 years ago, because that was Nolan's backstory with Kagura and Jaya and the Golden Bell and everything like that. Of course, we know around 900 years ago, or like 800 to 900 years ago, was the events of the Void Century, right? We know a couple of other random dates throughout, and one of those random dates is around 300 years ago. It involved the Jerma Double Six, which is really the only event that was directly to have been mentioned around 3 centuries ago. Around 300 years ago, in the North Blue, the Jerma Double Six ruled over that ocean for 66 days. And so then their rule came to an end, and they were dismantled, and they fell apart. And then now in the story, we have Judge, who's trying to rebuild the Jerma Double Six and get back to that, like, golden time where they ruled over the entire North for just a mere 66 days. But Judge was like, I want to get back to that time period. So probably has nothing to do with Elder Jarl and Jorul, but hey, I mean, maybe if we ever get a flashback involving the Giants 300 years ago, maybe there'll be some mention of, like, who knows? Maybe it actually connected perfectly. Maybe Jarl and Jorul were the ones that took out the Jerma 300 years ago. They ruled over all the North Blue. They were living at large. They were like, we finally did it. And then all of Judge's ancestor was there, like, we finally did it. And then all of a sudden, the giant warrior pirates showed up and just absolutely decimated them in like one night or something like that. And that's all they're said about it, right? So, yeah, that's the only thing we know about it beyond that, and we have nothing really else. By the way, though, something else I wanted to mention, this takes place around 400 years ago, but it confirmed something that I thought this was something like a fact of One Piece that I had heard a while ago, and I couldn't place it, and it was that Ryuma, the sword god from Wano, lived around 400 years ago. And I said that as if like, oh yeah, that's something that was confirmed at one point, and I could never like figure out where it was. It was confirmed at least in a One Piece magazine. That is where that came from. Now, usually the stuff that's in the One Piece magazine is stuff from like Oda's records and like his sketches and his notes and things for the story. So more than likely 400 years ago was around the time that Ryuma did live, and then he slayed a dragon over Wano, and all that stuff occurred. I guess it's not 100% canon. It was never mentioned in the story yet, but it was in a One Piece magazine. At least that's where that source comes from, all right? I just found that out while I was going through the timeline, all right? So just wanted to mention that, all right? So, yeah, let's say Jarl and Jorul back in the day, they were sailing on what would have been, like, I guess the Great Eric, maybe the original Great Eric, and Oda's probably setting this up as like, okay, we have the Void Century around 900 years ago, and we have the present day. We have a lot of stuff that we need to fill out. I mean, like, we know a little bit, like, we know around 500 years ago is when Ors died, and he froze, you know, the Great Continent Polar Ors. We know around 700 years ago is when the Great Bridges were beginning construction. Rum Wolf, Vodka Wolf, Bourbon Wolf, and Tequila Wolf, right? So that's really all we know, though. So you got all this time to really fill out, and I think Oda's really going to start doing that as we lead into this final arc, this final series of arcs, right, into Lodestar and everything. It was just like, no, there was something really big that happened 400 years ago involving Ryuma. Oh, there was also something really big happening 300 years ago involving the Germa 66 and Jarl and Jorul, right? To really connect all this together, because the idea I think we're going about here is that the whole thing with the mermaid princess that can communicate with the Sea Kings, and the resurrection of Joy Boy, and, you know, the inherited will and all that stuff, Davy Jones, all that kind of shit, that happened at multiple points throughout the centuries. It's not like Luffy is the first person to have the Sun God fruit in the last 900 years. It's just he's the first person to awaken it, right? Blackbeard is not the first person to bear the moniker of Davy D. Jones. So there were other people throughout history, like you could even say Noland might have been a candidate to inherit the will of Joy Boy, and there might have been somebody else like 600 years ago, and somebody else like 200-ish years ago that would have embodied all this stuff. It's really, I think, about just getting everybody together at one point in time to satisfy like all of the requirements of this prophecy, right? Like you need somebody that carries on the inherited will of Joy Boy and Davy D. Jones at the same point in time, and the person that inherits the will of Joy Boy has to awaken the Gumu Gumu no Mi, or the Sun God fruit, and then you also need a mermaid princess that is capable of summoning all of the Sea Kings at the same time. Like all of these moving parts have to exist at the same time, right? Now, the reason this ties back into the Giants is because the Giants worship the Sun God. They worship Nika. Now, the idea is that Nika has different features or traits depending on which version of the Harley you're reading, right? In some versions of the Harley, in like the first age, he is like a god of destruction and like just death and fire. And then in other versions, he is a trickster deity. And then in other versions, he's a deity of like hope that brings laughter and joy and freedom and everything like that, right? And so there's all these different versions of the Sun God. Was there an actual Sun God at some point? Were there just different people that had these devil fruit abilities that used them in different ways? Who knows, right? Now, we know that Loki refers to himself as the Sun God, and the other giants all worship, you know, the Sun God as well, so it's not completely ridiculous to think that 300 years ago, we could have had a different mermaid princess, we could have had a different representative of the Davy D. Jones clan sort of thing, and then, you know, one of Rox's ancestors, and then we also had Jarl and Jorul, and maybe Jarl declared himself like, I am the Sun God. The thing about prophecies is so you can sort of bend them to mean whatever you want them to mean, right? And I think that's maybe an aspect Oda's going to go about with it, right? There's nothing in this prophecy that is like straightforward. Like literally he explained it at the very beginning. All of these different giants got into a fight at the banquet over the nature of like Nika, of what the Sun God is really all about. Like, he's a god of freedom. No, he's a god of destruction. No, he's a god of laughter. No, he's a trickster. You know, they were getting into a fight over this shit because it's an old ass prophecy that nobody really knows how to, like, okay, well, what's the proper way of how this works? And they might all be true, is the other thing. These could all have been true at different points in the history of One Piece, right? So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're going to lead into like a flashback because we just got out of a flashback, but this might be setting stuff up for much later. We might get a flashback. In fact, honestly, what I think this would be really cool if Oda did this. I mean, I would personally like this. If in the lead up to the Void Century, right, like this big flashback where we find out what was going on 900 to 800 years ago, wouldn't it be sick to start that flashback going back in time, like incrementally? So maybe Oda takes a few chapters to show us what was happening 100 years ago, and then 200 years ago, and then 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, and then after all, like we're learning about it in reverse, because a lot of that stuff we already know. Like we get to 400 years back and Oda just kind of like recaps Nolan's flashback a little bit. Like maybe we have a moment where Nolan, because he was a botanist, he was an explorer, maybe there was a moment where on one of Nolan's adventures he finds a poneglyph, or he finds some text on a wall somewhere and he's writing in his logbook of like what happened during the Void Century all those centuries ago, right? And so we just go back to 500 years, we see ores getting frozen, we go back to, we don't know anything about really 600 years ago. Then we go back to 700 years ago when the Celestial Dragons first gave the order to build the bridges. And then finally, all of this leads up, like we're sitting there reading this and we're like, oh my God, it's going to happen. We're finally going to learn, where does this all come from? Like, what is the source of all this? We go back in time. This would be so cool. Every single century, we focus on a particular person. It could be a scholar like Nolan. It could be just a random pirate. It could be like a warrior like Jarl or Jorul. And they're just wondering about like what is the origin of this ruin, or where did these poneglyphs come from, or what happened with the world government, how did they take control? Like people from the last 900 years have been wondering this, and then it just goes all the way into reverse until we finally reach 900 years ago, the beginning of the Void Century. We're at the Ancient Kingdom. This is where it all started. That would be sick, and I would love that to be the like framing device for the Void Century flashback. Okay, so moving back to Jarl, because I know we were getting a little bit off topic there. This is Jarl's video. I want to focus on him a little bit. Also in the last chapter, he's ready to fight, right? Dory and Bragi arrive at the village. Hyrule, Stanson, and Zoro are almost there as well. Don't worry, Zoro has a plan. I'm sure it'll work out great. But you see Elder Jarl pull out a sword, and he's like, let's go, right? And all the other giants of the village are like, yeah! They got like a pep talk from the Elder, the greatest warrior of all time, apparently, right? So they're ready to fight. They're ready to go for it, okay? So I don't think it's the sword that he had in his head, because Oda did not actually show him pulling the sword out of his head, which I feel like he would have. And then also, in addition to that, the sword that Jarl is holding has a different guard than the one in his head. The one that is in his head is Harold's old sword, which, by the way, in its own right, is probably like a Saijo Awazamono, because they mention it has like some prestige to it. It has like the Meito ranking, right? And it was a sword that actually was originally Jarl's, and Jarl kind of like bequeathed it, kind of gave it to Harold, okay? And then Harold was like, I have to return it now. And he stabs him in the head. Also, by the by, it really does seem like we were throwing out ideas, like especially during that flashback, with like him having memory loss because he had a sword stabbed in his cranium. That doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, like, at least not any kind of memory loss that we're aware of. Jarl is still able to speak and remember events. It's not like he forgot about what happened at the castle because he had a sword in his head. It's just that he was faithful to Loki's request of not telling everybody. And he even tells everybody in the last chapter, like, Loki is innocent. He might be a boorish fellow, but he wasn't the one that killed Harold. I mean, well, that's the thing. Jarl kind of fudges it a little bit, where he's like, yeah, it was a demon that killed Harold, which is ultimately true, yes, but Loki was the one to deliver the finishing blow to his dad, right? So anyway, it seems like Jarl can remember things very well. He remembers what events occurred and everything like that. He was just telling, a different version for the people to get them, excited and fight together, and then he picks up a sword and he goes in to fight, right? So, we're maybe going to see some cool shit here. Maybe we're going to see some cool, like, this is the hockey of a giant warrior, the true giant warrior. Now, he's an old man. That's the thing, right? Like, age will eventually, take away even the greatest warrior's strength. But it makes me wonder, it really does, how strong was Jarl back in the day? Oh, man, he was so strong. He put Roger and Rox and Garp, all of those characters, to shame. I'll tell you how strong Jarl was 300 years ago. Jarl had all of the power of Kaido in his pinky. You know what I mean? Like, all all of the power of Roger in one of his thumbs. You know, it's just like that was how strong Elder Jarl was. We just start like hyping up this character like crazy. And then we have Loki, who has the power of the legendary devil fruit. That's another thing that needs to be addressed during the Void Century flashback. Apparently there was probably a giant that had that power during the Void Century, and no giant since then has ever been able to consume it. That's always actually been an interesting thing. That is something that is oddly absent from all of the lore we've learned about the giants. We know there's this legendary devil fruit. We don't know anything about who the original user was. There would have been a giant that would have allied with Joy Boy's faction. We know that much just through like context, but this individual has never been mentioned. He's never been mentioned like, oh yes, the great giant warrior Odin or Ymir. Ymir might work because Ymir was like one of the original primordial giants. In the beginning of Norse mythology, really quick, nothing existed. It was an empty wasteland where the only two things to exist were a cow and a giant. And that giant was named Ymir, right? So maybe like, oh yes, during the Void Century, there was a big giant, an ancient giant named Ymir. And he was the one that allied with Joy Boy's faction, and he had the legendary devil fruit. I would assume it would be something like that, but we don't know anything. Like, we don't even know if this giant existed other than just like contextual stuff from like other stories we've learned about, right? That's all. So we need to learn a little bit more about that, and I think we'll probably learn more about that like post Elbaf, like after this whole battle with the Gods Knights ends, and in whatever state Elbaf will be in at the end, we're gonna learn some more things about Elder Jarl and him being a giant warrior pirate, and we're also gonna learn some stuff about, we're gonna see what Loki's devil fruit is clearly before the end of the arc. I think that's not going to be a secret until like the end of the story or anything. Oda is gonna reveal that by the end of Elbaf in some really epic double-page spread moment where he shows up to fight Emu or whatever, and Luffy will be there and everything, probably riding on top of Loki as an eagle. Loki's gonna come screaming in as an eagle. Luffy's gonna be on his back, and he's gonna be like, yeah! Here we go, right? That's going to be fun. And then in addition to that, maybe we'll go up to the Sun Realm, not the Sun Realm, the Heaven Realm, the Astral Plane above the Sun Realm, and we'll learn more stuff about things. Maybe that's where the tombs of the ancient giants are. We'll see the tomb of the original giant that made the promise with Joy Boy, something of that nature. We'll learn more about it. And we also have like the facility, a place that had been there for like 3,000 years that like Lilith and Bonnie are at right now, right? So yeah, there's a lot of stuff in Elbaf. That tree might be coming down at some point. It's like timber. It's going to go down at some point, but I think we need to learn some stuff before that happens, right? And then, at some of the worst points in the story, like right when everything seems lost, where like the world is falling apart and the flood is upon us and everything, that's probably when the great tree will fall down and we'll all be like, no! And maybe it'll be representative of like new life being born out of the ashes, like the battle finally ends after this 900-year period, and like the fourth age starts, and we all start anew. Maybe that'll be the final, like, the message of One Piece, I guess. This video was really scattershotted, it was like all over the place. I was trying to focus on Jarl, and a lot of this stuff does. But yeah, it just ended up going in different directions. Anyway, you know how that goes. Anyway, this will be Techie 101 signing out, everybody. Barry, stay right where you are. I'm coming to save you as fast as I can.